From New York.
Mr. Chair, I rise to offer my amendment number 92 to the Interior Appropriations Bill to prohibit funding for President Biden's Executive Order 14019, entitled Executive Order on Promoting Access to Voting. This order requires federal agencies to use their power, influence, resources, and federal funding to enter into agreements with non-governmental organizations to conduct voter registration and other mobilization activities. Mr. Chair, this executive order is nothing but a blatant attempt to transform the federal government into a partisan get-out-the-vote machine for Democrats. The Department of Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency should be completely nonpartisan and should not be using taxpayer funds and resources to actively engage in get-out-the-vote operations that have nothing to do with the department's core missions, not to mention the obvious mission creep and Hatch Act violations that this activity triggers. Mr. Chair, President Biden should not be weaponizing the federal agencies and the federal government using American taxpayer dollars to manipulate and steer our elections in a partisan manner. And let me be clear, the Department of Interior is actively carrying out Executive Order 14019. The Heritage Foundation has subpoenaed numerous documents and emails related to the Department of Interior's implementations of this radical executive order, including this interim plan, which I show and give for the record, that is fully redacted. Fully redacted. I wonder why the department would fully redact this plan if it had nothing to hide. As the co-founder and chair of the Election Integrity Caucus, it is my privilege to introduce this amendment to restore transparency and confidence in our democratic process, while keeping partisan federal bureaucrats and the swamp, literally, from deliberately tipping the balance at the ballot box. I stand firmly behind the concept of one citizen, one vote, as enshrined in our Constitution. However, I do not support this blatantly partisan mobilization of the federal government for political purposes. The funds appropriated in this bill should be used as intended, such as to protect public lands, for hunting, fishing, not implementing a partisan get-out-the-vote initiative using federal dollars and using federal employees. With that, Mr. Chair, I urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, which will preserve election integrity and stop the Biden administration from transforming the Department of Defense into a get-out-the-vote partisan machine for the Democrats. Let's make voting great again. I reserve.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Maine seek recognition?
I seek time in opposition to this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment. The right to vote is a foundation of American democracy. Free and fair elections are a hallmark of our country, and all Americans should have the opportunity to exercise their right to vote without confronting obstacles. The laws of the United States prohibit racial discrimination, but we are aware of instances where Americans in certain communities are confronted with long lines at the polls or barriers to their participation. I'm disappointed my colleague would want to restrict funding for this executive order that strives to make voter registration easier, expand access to information, and make voting more accessible. My colleagues across the aisle talk about protecting First and Second Amendment rights, yet they would prohibit funding for efforts to ensure the basic democratic right for every American to vote. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I respectfully disagree with my colleague's interpretation of this bill. I can't think of anything worse than having people who are on an important mission working in the Department of Interior or other agencies than getting them out to engage in partisan get-out-the-vote efforts, being at the polls, helping people vote. That is not their job. That is the job of the states. Each one of the states is required under law to make sure and administer our elections and to be sure that we have one citizen, one vote, that we have free and fair elections and access to voting. That is not the job of the federal government. In fact, federal employees are prohibited from this kind of illegal activity under the Hatch Act. And for that reason, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and prohibit our dollars and our employees from being forced to get engaged in partisanship at the ballot box instead of working on keeping our communities safe and keeping our environment free from some of the interferences that we're seeing from the Biden administration. And with that, I yield.
The gentlewoman from New York yields.